Hey everyone, welcome back to Deadlight. I'm sharing 10 real, unsettling tales of experiences with feral individuals in the Blue Ridge Mountains on today's episode. People came to the realization that they were not as isolated in the forest as they had initially believed. Please think about subscribing before we start, and remember to like and share it with your friends. Tell me where you're watching. Many thanks to all of you. Let's get started now. When I made the decision to go on that lonesome mountain trek in Story 1, I was 20 years old. I wanted a vacation from people, deadlines, and the monotonous routine of discussions, noise, and obligations. I just needed some air, I told my roommate. The courteous version was that. It was more difficult to explain the truth. I had to get out of my apartment, out of the city, and out of my mind. I did not wish to be accessible. I desired silence. The kind of sound you get when your phone dies and you can only hear your own footsteps. Mara is my name. Deep under the comments of a blog that hadn't been updated in years, I discovered this trail on the internet. Not a hiking forum, not an official park website, just someone talking incoherently about lost routes and myths. The type of digital dust that you find at 2 in the morning when you have no idea what you're searching for. One name stood out, the Hollow of Carter. No map showed it. The instructions were ambiguous, bordering on contemptuous, as if the author was defying people to locate it. Then he wrote, untouchable, quiet in the spiritual sense, whatever that meant. I only needed to hear that. I departed prior to dawn. I was the sole vehicle remaining on the road after 6 hours of back roads and progressively smaller towns. My phone lost signal at around 10 o'clock. There are no bars or GPS, only trees, static, and a long gravel road that leads nowhere. I eventually arrived at what I assumed to be the spawn to half-skin weeds were given by a rusting cattle. Although it didn't appear to be an entrance, it closely followed the blog's instructions. I stopped, loaded up my bag with water bottles, beef jerky, a flashlight, notebook, compass, a lighter, a barely functional emergency whistle, and a lock. Then I entered. The hike started off wonderfully. The air was crisp and clear. There was a profound, unspoiled silence in the forest. No noises of faraway roads. No planes in the sky. Only the occasional trickle of branches and the crunch of pine needles beneath your feet. I followed faint boot-shaped depressions that appeared to be trail-worn grass. Just enough to keep me going, but not much. I felt relieved, as though I had at last been freed from the bustle of things. The track diminished after a few hours. Not all at once. It simply ceased resembling a trail and began to resemble any other forest area. I paused and took a few steps back, but I couldn't tell where I'd gone wrong. I reasoned that if I continued in the same route, it would resurface. That was the first error. The trees surrounding me began to change. They were taller, denser, and more densely packed than the trees found close to trailheads. With trunks as large as dinner tables and moss hanging like faded flags. These appeared to be quite old. It felt thinner with the light coming through, that it's just farther away, not darker. I observed that everything was motionless. Just me, my boots, and my breathing. No insects, no birds, no chirping. Slowly, the realization that something was wrong crept in. I stopped, pulled out my water bottle, sat on a fallen log, and attempted to reset before realizing what had happened. It was initially difficult to detect the structure nestled between 2 drooping pines. Age caused the wood to slump and turn black, as if it had absorbed decades worth of rain. The roof of a crooked hut sloped inward. A wall appeared to have been punched through. On its hinges hung the door, or what was remained of it. Hunter's cabin was my first thought. An old outpost, perhaps. Out here, people lived. Even though I was aware of that, something fell off. Too silent, too void. I was unable to ignore it. My curiosity drew me in. It was worse inside. Only shadows were visible in the corners where the doorway's light did not reach. The ground drooped inward. The scent of moist rot hit quickly. Was there something sharper underneath? Old blood or rust? My nose was covered. It was empty. Nothing that indicated someone had lived here, including equipment and furnishings. Only a pile of dark cloth in the distant corner and a rusting tin pot by the fireplace. I entered. There was a squeak in the door. I went cold. The fabric moved only a little. The floor, or perhaps the wind. However, my stomach turned. With my heart racing, I quickly backed out. I told myself that I was exaggerating. It's either nothing or a raccoon behind the cloth. I didn't linger, though. Now I turned and left more quickly. Not yet, not running. Simply brisk and concentrated. However, the woodland no longer had the same appearance. An overly familiar tree appeared every several minutes. The opposite direction was an interminable slope that I was certain I had recently traveled. I felt as though I had been unknowingly spun. Then I noticed it once again. The shack. The tin pot was gone, but the door was open and the wall was leaning. I stayed outside. I changed my course and walked quickly. I ceased looking at the compass. Give up thinking. Simply follow your instincts. Eventually, the quiet ended. There was movement to my left, and finally right. Nor animals, nor casual rustling. Intentionally, my footsteps mirrored mine. I paused. They halted. I listened through my ears' blood rush while I waited. Just trees and my heartbeat, nothing else. I walked slowly. The steps came closer again. Dragging that I took off running. Branches tangled my legs and whacked my face. I stumbled once, fell hard, got back up, and continued going. Then I noticed it. Smoke. Between the trees are thin strands. I pressed into an open space. Low flickering firelight across flesh and bark. 3 or more people were huddled around the fire with their backs to me. I almost burst into tears. I yelled for assistance. They remained still. Didn't say anything. Simply twitched as if they were paying attention. Not to me, to another thing. I moved in closer. Nothing has changed. I yelled louder this time. One turned. Its skin was pale and sickly, and its face was covered in filth. Its mouth is slightly open. Its eyes are round and glaring. Its yellow teeth are misaligned, and it has no nose, just 2 dark holes in the center of its face. It looked directly at me. The others turned after that. I took a step back and crunched the leaves. The closest one was naked with scabs and scars, joints bursting, and 2 thin skins stretched over bone. Like an animal, it sniffed the air, and they made a lunge. Each and every one. I immediately turned and fled. Panic, no thought. Pure adrenaline. I ran till my chest heaved, and I fell behind a log. With my palm clamped over my mouth, I remained still. They went by me. For stealthy, swift figures weaved between trees. One paused close to me, took a whiff, cocked its head, and then continued. Until their firelight went out, I remained motionless. I finally got up, my legs trembling. I went in the other direction. Listened intently, slowly. Hours, or perhaps minutes that seemed like hours, passed. Then I noticed it. Only the shape of a trail, marking remains on a rusty and deformed metal sign. Nothing to say. A hole from a bullet close to the top, past my automobile, the road, and it. I staggered to it, fumbled with my keys, shoved myself in, and got behind the wheel. I continued driving till I came to a petrol station that was bright with fluorescent lights that buzzed and people that didn't smell like blood and grime. That night and the next, I didn't sleep. I told myself it was a breakdown from solitude, stress, and dehydration. Story 2. Music. At the age of 22, I consented to go on a 4-day trip with 2 of my best friends, Caleb and Mira, through a portion of the Blue Ridge Mountains. For months, we had been kicking the concept around. One of those discussions that, for some reason, never gets past the planning stage is one that we should definitely have. However, we followed through this time. We were looking for more than a respite from flashing screens, traffic, and work that we desired a raw, open space. Blisters sleeping outside, and the sense that we had accomplished something. We weren't total beginners. We had completed a number of day walks, and even a few overnights. However, this was not like the others. We would be out there for days for the first time. No espiri turnaround. There's no car a mile away. We organized our equipment over the course of several weekends. We tried to pack as light as possible without being careless. Compass, maps, water filters, tents, and dehydrated food. Mira took care of the practical aspects. In addition to a satellite phone that his cousin had provided him, Caleb had a bear canister. Just in case, he added, patting it theatrically as though it were a holy artifact. On a Thursday, we departed. The trail's first section began gently, was clearly signposted, was largely sheltered, and had a few gentle rises but nothing too steep. We took our time, pausing to joke around, take stupid photos, and refill water. Whether to have dinner before or after camp was the only actual choice. We located a location next to a sluggish creek by the early evening. The clearing appeared to have been used previously. A half circle of stones from someone else's fire pit. Not too many roots and level enough for tents. The stove was set up by Mira. Using the tar, Caleb worked. I took our bottles down to the water. I became aware of them at that point. Footsteps close to the bank. I initially believed that they belonged to us, but I was mistaken. They were odd, aimed in the wrong direction, and too far apart. The tread was nearly worn away, yet they resembled shoe prints. Subtle ridges that appeared to have been smoothed out by rubbing the soles. Also, the shape was incorrect. It appeared as though the person had been walking on the outside borders of their feet, since the toes were wider and the heel was narrower. Additionally, they were traveling directly from the brook into the trees rather than in circles. Just to see how far they went, I took a few steps after them. Scuff marks were dragging in the loose ground, as if the person who made them hadn't lifted their feet correctly. When I felt the prickling along my arms, I took a step back. Caleb looked and shrugged when I pointed them out. He replied it was probably a hunter or something. Mira glanced at them and nodded. Either that, or another bunch just went through. It appears to be old. I refrained from arguing. Perhaps they were correct. However, there was something about the uneven march that bothered me, like if someone had tripped through it and never returned. We had a big crash that night that I must have passed out quickly after climbing, sunbathing, and eating carbohydrates. I woke up to silence the next thing I can recall. I had no idea what had roused me from my slumber. I simply lay in the dark, blinking. Then I heard it. Not wind, not animal. Go slowly and steadily. Something circling, not pacing, not intentional, but looping with a slight drag against the soil. I remained motionless, speculating that it might be a raccoon moving or the creaking of trees. However, the sound persisted almost in a beat. There's a shuffle, a pause, and then another. I saw him when I unzipped the tent just enough to get a glimpse that a man squatted close to the fire pit. The final flickers were sufficient to reveal his shape, but the coals had mostly gone out. His ribs protruded from his naked chest like jagged lines beneath his skin, and he was slumped low. He had oily ropes of hair. Something dark had ripped and stiffened his pants. He seems to have been without a home or companions for a very long period. His hands were sifting among the ashes as though he were doing a food hunt. Nor desperate, nor furious, but methodical. Then he looked around. He had hazy, whitish eyes. They were empty, as if no one recognized them. Neither bright nor dramatic. I held my breath. Didn't flinch. Then, as if his neck wasn't working properly, his head jerked sharply and twitched toward me. I fumbled and snagged my thumb while zipping the tent down so quickly. Caleb, startled awake as Whisper called his name. Next, we woke me up. There were only the remaining remnants of the fire, and no one else when we peered out together. It was a dream, I told myself half-heartedly. Perhaps sleep paralysis. However, we discovered one of our apples in the ground close to the camp's perimeter in the morning. Deep and crooked bite marks from half-eaten food, as if the person chewed without using all of their teeth. I just pushed it into a sentence without saying anything. Bag and advised them to leave early. They did not quarrel. We continued going on a second day, but the atmosphere had changed. Look around more and talk less. The trail began to feel deserted. No one else was visible to us. There were signs, but no hikers, no new tracks. Branches broke off at strange heights. A second path that repeatedly splits off and rejoins ours. Inconspicuous through the undergrowth at all times. I once noticed movement on a ridge below us. Between the trees, 3 figures weave. Not standing, squatting, or crawling too quickly. They vanished as soon as I blinked. Did not speak up. Didn't want to be the one who was paranoid. The air felt heavier by the time we came to a rest for the night, as if someone was watching us. Not in a scary movie sense, but rather as a persistent, silent pressure in the back of the mind. Without much conversation, we made camp. Ate without talking. I didn't get any sleep that night. Mira, based on how frequently she shifted, didn't either. It began again around midnight. A finger dragging slowly across the tent, pressure, one hand first, then another, through the nylon on my fingers, knuckles, and palm. I could sense its curvature. It went gently, as if it were learning the texture by heart. It pressed flat after that. Faint lines were left by long fingernails scraping down. The undersides of the nails were thick and black. I remained motionless and did not breathe. Then it vanished without a word. Footsteps ran, too fast to follow, bare feet pounding against earth. At daybreak, we woke up. Our food bag's rope was sliced clean. All the food is gone, not dispersed. Lost. Even the garbage. Something sharp was whispered by Caleb. Mira's hands trembled as she attempted to laugh it off. We were going back, I said. It did not quarrel. The longest day of my life was the hike out. I sensed that everyone was watching us. I looked around and saw shapes move. Hints and flickers, an arm slipping under a trunk, a leg stepping out of sight, never direct. The noises trailed behind us, never quite within our grasp. Breaking twigs and leaves underweight, rustling, shifting soil. There was silence when we halted. It began all over again when we relocated. Over loose rock, the last stretch was steep and uphill. My legs were burning. Despite my raw lungs, I continued. Was unable to stop. Then I turned around. On the ridge stood 6 figures. Close enough to see, yet not close enough. They were skinny, and starving. Mats of hair strung. Some wore garment scraps. Others are only belt-tied rags. Tightly stretched across bone, their skin was gray. They didn't move. They all remained silent. They did nothing except observe. Our speed did not decrease. Didn't say anything. We arrived at the parking lot and forcefully closed the car door. It wasn't until I went to start the engine that I realized my hands were shaking. I kept both hands on the wheel as I navigated the twisting road. Never once glanced in the mirrors. Music Story 3. Everything that had happened before college had burned my brain. Decisions, deadlines, and inquiries about my desires with relation to my life. As if I should already have everything planned out. I so made the decision to go missing for a week or so. I packed up some equipment, a stack of paperbacks, and enough instant porridge to feed a small army, and borrowed my dad's old canvas tent. The heavy green one he used to take on fishing excursions before life became too hectic. It was an easy strategy. Locate a peaceful area in the Blue Ridge Mountains, make camp, and spend 7 days reading, hiking, fishing, and cooking around a campfire until my mind stopped racing. Just woods, water, and silence. No people, no services. I discovered a location approximately 0.5 miles from a designated path. It was far enough that I wouldn't run into other hikers, but not too far away. It was near a small, steady-flowing creek with a flat area that was ideal for setting up a tent. It even had some logs configured that resembling improvised benches, most likely left there by a previous camper. As the sun sank below the hills, I pitched the tent, hung my food bag out of reach in the woods, and built a fire. The first 2 days were as calm as a textbook. I went fishing in the creek, strolled aimlessly down side paths, woke up to the sound of birds, and returned to read by the fire till my eyes were watering. Both nights, I slept like a log. How chilly it is at 9, with no awakening. It seemed to be just what I needed. However, things changed on the 3rd evening. I returned from my fishing trip a bit later than normal. As the sun had set, I was debating whether to try cooking the small trout I had caught, or to just have a granola bar and go to bed. When I entered the camp, I noticed something. A pile of rocks stood in a makeshift tower-like structure close to the fire pit. In a strangely exact manner, 5 or 6 stones of various shapes perched on top of one another. Although it wasn't very large, perhaps knee-high, the way it was balanced gave the impression that someone had taken the time to get it just so. For a moment, I simply stood there and gazed at it. Since arriving, I hadn't seen anyone, and I hadn't made it. I initially assumed that someone had probably gone through during the day, perhaps when I was out on the trails, and I simply left it there. A path marking of some sort. Who knows, our project. It felt strange, but not particularly dangerous. After giving it a gentle prod with my boot, I kicked it harder and knocked it over when it swayed, but did not fall. After then, I didn't give it any thought. I read a few chapters of my book, cooked my trout poorly, and then, as usual, I fell asleep by the fire. I unzipped the tent the following morning, went outside barefoot, and froze. Another heap of rocks was present. This one was nearer. It was taller than the last one, perhaps to my waist, and just next to the tent, not even 2 feet from the flap. The same strange equilibrium. Round stone on flat stone. Like a piece of art, a leaf jammed between 2 of them. When I went to sleep, it wasn't there. I was certain of that. There was a strange little skip in my heart. I remained motionless as I stared at it. There was silence in the woods. Just the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. No wind, no sound. I turned slowly in a circle, scanning the woods, almost expecting to see someone standing just beyond the tree end, but all I could see were trees in that low, continuous psychism. In fact, I told myself aloud that it was meaningless. There must have been another wanderer. Perhaps that was a strange joke. Perhaps I simply didn't hear them approaching. It might have been nothing. 2 didn't really taste the breakfast that was prepared. I was always looking at the woods. I hiked farther than usual that day. There isn't a true path. Instead, you have to go quickly while bushwhacking through vegetation and crossing side trails. The trail was not on my mind. All I had to do was move. I had the impression that I was being pursued and that someone was pulling me onward. I was tired by the time I returned, despite the fact that I was unable to see or hear anyone. My legs were covered in scrapes, and my shirt was wet with sweat. From a distance, the clearing appeared normal, but as soon as I entered, I realized something was amiss. I had left the cooler next to the log bench, but it was gone. I initially believed that I might have simply relocated it earlier and forgotten. Then I noticed it sitting in the brush, about 30 or 40 feet distant, as if someone had thrown it there. The majority of the food was gone, and the lid was open. Everything from my final can of chili to granola packets to snacks. Here was my first thought. It must have been a bear. It must have been a bear. Then I looked at the tent, though. There was an open flap. That was not as I had left it. I approached carefully, feeling queasy. The tent appeared to be in good condition. There was no tearing or shredding, as one might anticipate from an animal. I got down on my knees and peered inside. With the exception of the sleeping bag, everything remained as I left it. It had been bound with a green vine and rolled up neatly and tightly. The long piece was gathered, threaded through, and knotted around the bag as if someone had taken the effort to do it. Multiple times, in fact. Despite its awkwardness, the knot held. Too human, too cautious to be random. I made no attempt to untie it. I simply took out my blade and sliced through the vine. I had trembling hands. The temperature had dropped, but I was still perspiring. I had no idea what to do. Get your belongings and go hiking. Even at a good speed, the closest lot was at least 2 hours distant, and it was now late afternoon. That night, I made the fire enormous. Enormous. Larger than I required. With my flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other, I sat directly against it. I didn't read. I skipped meals. I simply waited while gazing into the trees. I heard the sound at around midnight. No speech, no footsteps. The sound was low and fragmented, like someone trying to cough, but suppressing it. One after the other, a deep guttural sound exploded. It came from my left, then there was silence, and then it came from my right once more. There was no rhythm, only these brief bursts of sound. Too keen to be an animal, too low to be speech. I sat still. The hairs on my arms stood on end. The burning seemed pointless. Maybe 10 feet in any direction was all I could see. Beyond that, it's completely dark. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I had decided by morning. In record speed, I packed everything. Didn't make any rolls that neglected to fold the tent. Simply stuffed everything into the pack and started walking. I didn't bother eating, and I kept the knife in my pocket. Just as I was securing the tent with my straps, something shifted. Through the woods, I could just make out a figure across the ridge. Then 3 more, then another. They were watching from a low crouch. Not moving, not coming, simply motionless. Rags clinging to their limbs, skin black with filth, hair hanging in twisted coils. They remained silent and did not blink. I turned my head, acted as though I didn't see them, and began to go, but they didn't follow. Each time the path veered, or occasionally, I would look back and see them, always at the same distance, stooping when I stopped and moving when I moved. They moved incorrectly, moving too quickly in brief spurts, as if they were creeping low to the earth and then abruptly launching themselves forward. I made an effort to ignore them. They sped up as I did, but I continued to stroll. They jogged when I did. They also sprung into motion when I eventually started running, cracking through bush, darting between trees. It was everywhere. I had no idea how many. How close I couldn't tell. The rocks then appeared. The path curving close to a little creek, I splattered through it without slowing down, soaking my boots as I slipped on the slippery stones. I stumbled to my feet on the far bank, my heart pounding and my breathing laboring. Then a boulder struck the trail in front of me with a thump. Little, only stomped and rolled a bit. Then one more and one more. They were being flung from the ridge from above. I covered my head, ducked, and ran. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, I was out of the trees. The gravel lot appeared as the trees split open. There was my automobile covered in leaves, still intact somehow. I continued. Didn't turn around. I put my equipment in the back, wrenched the door open, and dove in. On the first attempt, the engine started. I'm grateful. I looked in the rearview mirror as I pulled out. They were present. 5 individuals were huddled together along the forest line, observing without moving. I didn't stop until I was halfway down a bag of trail mix that I couldn't remember opening and 3 towns distant. For years have passed since then. Since then, I haven't gone camping. Story 4. This occurred when I was 30 years old. For some time, my cousin Jay had been sending me images, films, maps, and anything else he could think of on the Blue Ridge Mountains that he always showed me something fresh while we spoke. He told me, "You've never seen stars like this. It seems like the paths stretch on forever. It is superior to therapy." After a while, we decided to go hiking for a long weekend. Only the 2 of us. All we had for 3 nights was freeze-dried food, trail mix, and whatever peace of mind we could wrest from the trees. I gave it my all. Then he ran away the night before we were about to depart. Still in the workplace, he called me from his car and apologized profusely. He claimed that deadlines had changed, that he was unable to take time off, and that work had piled up. The tent rolled tightly next to the door, and I sat there with my backpack already packed. The more I looked at all of my equipment, the less I wanted to back out. At first, I thought, all right, well, trip's off. I had previously hiked alone, though not as deep, but I wasn't inexperienced. I had my maps, my compass, and even a spare phone battery. I didn't anticipate a signal, and there was a quiet side of me that kind of liked the thought of being by myself in the woods. So I went. It was the ideal first day out. I got exactly what I wanted, even though it wasn't Instagram perfect or postcard perfect. I registered at the board, parked at a trailhead west of the small village of Selbridge, and set out. The trail followed a slow-moving stream for a bit before dipping down through dense vegetation. I passed acorns beneath my boots, early indications of fall red gold leaves curling beneath my feet, and the road noises diminished as I continued to walk. After the first hour, I saw no one. In the late afternoon, I discovered a bend in the stream that opened up into a flat-banked, shallow lake that was ideal for camping. I set up the tent, filtered some water, and prepared a depressing but palatable supper of jerky and noodles. After that, I laid down on a foam mattress, covered my eyes with my hat, and simply breathed. It wasn't a particularly memorable night. Only the rustle of trees, the activity of owls, and the buzzing of insects in the distance. Around 3 in the morning, I believe I woke up merely to roll over before falling back asleep peacefully. Exactly what I had come for .it was the same on the second day. I packed everything, dismantled my camp, and returned to the trail. I intended to continue the ridge, cut across a spur, and camp higher up in a loose loop. Nothing too dramatic. My main goal was to keep going and see where the silence would lead. I first observed the footprints around mid-morning. The path had gotten softer and more muddy. It wasn't quite a swamp, but it was wet enough that every step caused my boots to sink a little. And there were bare footsteps in the center of the path. Not new, but also not outdated. I stopped and looked around. There were no boot prints in the area, only these odd, flat marks. They were moving in the muck, perhaps 20 or 30 of them. I initially thought that someone had either misplaced their shoes while crossing the brook or gone barefoot for fun. Strange, to be sure, but not unprecedented. However, the more I gazed, the less they resembled ordinary feet. They were overly big. The toes were long and awkwardly separate from one another. No arch. The stride, if you could call it that, was everywhere, and the fronts of each foot sprang out almost like fingers. A strolling human was represented by several of the prints. Others were spaced farther apart. Occasionally, I noticed indications of something heavier, such as hands or knuckles pressing into the earth next to the feet. Squinting, I knelt down to attempt to understand it. It might have been several. Kids pulling a practical joke, perhaps. Humans and animals may cross paths. However, the more I examined them, the more I understood that they weren't mixed prints. There was only one object, one trail. Slowly, I got my feet. Once more, the woods were silent. It didn't sit well with me, but I wasn't exactly frightened. I told myself it was nothing and continued walking, because occasionally the forest mislead us. After a few hours, I became aware of another thing. That the sensation of being observed is not loud. It doesn't hit you in the head. It simply percolates. It's simple to dismiss at first. A strange shadow, a change in the wind, the impression that something moved when in fact it didn't. However, as the day wore on, that sensation clung to the back of my neck like a strand of spiderweb. I continued to look over my shoulder. I felt as though something was always a few feet behind me. Not because I heard anything. I believed I spotted movement between the woods more than once. Quick, low forms that dart barely out of sight. Additionally, everything around me froze whenever I paused to look. There was silence, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, with no rustling or birds singing. The trail ascended up a ridgeline with a respectable view of the valley by late afternoon. I reasoned that it would be a suitable location to spend the night. After stretching my back and dropping my pack close to a boulder, I proceeded in search of firewood. I saw it at that moment. There was something man-made, or at least not natural, farther up the slope, perhaps 20 or 30 yards off the trail. Some sort of structure. It appeared to be a rudimentary shelter. There might be a lean-to peeking out from between the trees. I went up to see what it was. It wasn't a lean-to. It was a circle of sharpened branches that were all poked into the ground like stakes and had string, rope, or something too pale tied together at the top dot and tattered to either. Bones, large and little, were scattered over the base. Others did not appear to have come from animals, but a few had obviously been chewed by animals. One stood out in particular. Hand-shaped, small and clean. Not a grown-up. A kid's. Nothing was touched by me. I didn't come nearer. Trying to breathe through the sudden constriction in my chest, I took one hesitant step at a time and retreated. What I had discovered had no logical explanation. No tradition of hunting in the backcountry. Not a joke. The mountains are not too far away. As I returned to camp, the sound of every branch crackling beneath my feet became unbearably loud. I ate a cardboard-tasting, dry, and bitter meal while sitting by my chilly fire pit. Eating felt like the only regular thing I could still do. So even as my stomach churned, I continued. The stillness returned worse that night. When the woods naturally get silent, you can tell. That wasn't this. Everything around me seemed to have deliberately halted, as if it were waiting. I listened while lying in my tent with my knife beneath my sleeping blanket. I doubt I ever actually dozed off. Not correctly. With my ears aching and my thoughts humming, I drifted in and out. I heard breathing at one point, hours into the night. It wasn't mine and it wasn't closed that way, but it was deep and steady outside, just on the other side of the nylon. Just breathing, not panting, not sniffing. As though someone was listening while standing there composed and waiting. I remained motionless. The breathing then changed. Like something squatting down, it slipped to the left along the tent's exterior before lowering itself. The cloth pressed against itself. There was a hand, if you could call it that, leaning against the tent side. The hand drags slowly across the material, and the fingers are too lengthy and spread wide. Then, on the other side, another hand emerged. Then some more. One behind me, one next to my head. They were all testing the surface in slow, methodical movements, as if they were understanding its contour. I was having trouble breathing. My lungs became stuck. My hands cramped as they clamped around the knife. I then made a move. I pulled down the zipper and rushed into the shadows. Didn't consider, didn't observe. Simply ran. The fire had been extinguished. The forest was dark, that I continued. Branches whipped over my face as I crashed through thorns and underbrush, barreling straight downhill. I heard them near me, behind me. The sounds were too quick and too low to be human. Not footsteps, not words, just hammering, unpredictable hits like bodies slamming against the ground in sudden bursts, hands and feet moving in unison, a lurching rhythm. Then they let out a scream. The sound was not human, stretched out and ragged. It was this high-pitched, twisted wail that resembled something that was failing at imitating an animal. My teeth ached as it reverberated through the forest. I found a trail marker, but I'm not sure how long I ran. A tree with a light splatter of white paint. I handled it as though it were sacred, then continued sprinting, from one marker to the next. No time to pause or reflect. When I wandered into a gravel road, the light was just coming up. Shaking, I fell to my knees. I didn't care that there was nothing behind me. I continued to move. I continued walking till my legs gave out. I then pulled myself up and continued to walk. I finally got on the freeway. I didn't ask questions, got picked up by a man in a truck, or stuck my thumb out. I kept the incident from Jay. Really, I never told anyone. Story 5. It happened when I was 17. The very mention of the Blue Ridge Mountains still makes my stomach turn, even after all these years. I received an invitation from my Uncle Curtis to spend a weekend at his cabin. Claimed that he needed assistance with some land work. A weekend of chopping, stacking, and hauling dead branches into piles was all that was intended to happen. In the evening, perhaps, if he felt generous, a few of drinks. Outside of a location known as Bridge Hollow, he possessed a little piece of land that backed up to the forest line. It's one of those remote places without even a stoplight. The sort of place where you're on your own and your GPS gives out after 10 miles. I gave him my all, that I needed a vacation from home, from school, and from the never-ending hum of life. My mother's younger brother was named Curtis. At family get-togethers, I'm always the quiet one. Smelled like gasoline and would smoke, and he didn't say more than was necessary. I thought I would benefit from spending a few days in the mountains with him. Something distinct. That wasn't incorrect of me, but not in the manner I had anticipated. The cabin was rudimentary. The best way to express it is that it had a porch that leaned slightly to the right, a single room, and a tin roof. No running water, no electricity. The door has no lock, merely an internal, thick wooden latch. Out front, he had set up some solar lights, although they were hardly functional. There were only a few dusty paperbacks with cracked spines, a wood furnace, an old couch that appeared to have been taken from trash, and shelves filled with tools, canned food, and other items. About 20 yards into the woods was a pit latrine and a hand pump for water out back. If you look closely enough, you can see that we immediately got to work on rustic charm. On the first day, nothing stopped. We transported brush piles to a clearing behind the cabin to burn, chopped and split logs, and removed deadfall from the underbrush. By lunchtime, my shoulders were burnt. I felt like I had aged 20 years by the time the sun disappeared behind the crest. When I was able to lift something big without dropping it, Curtis groaned or nodded periodically, but he didn't say much else. That we ate tomato sandwiches, his favorite, it seems, and drank well water from antique mason jars while sitting on the porch that evening. As we ate, he told me stories. Not the enjoyable type. Bears digging through the garbage. Coyotes approaching the fire pit too closely. After that, he began working on the mountain people. Out in the woods, you'll hear things, he remarked. Those who stay out of town dislike strangers. Entire families that are always in hollers. The government is unaware of their existence. I thought he was playing a practical joke on me, so I raised an eyebrow. Like vampires from Hillbilly? I inquired. He took a bite out of his sandwich and continued to gaze at the trees without laughing. Curtis took the couch that night, and I unrolled my sleeping bag on the floor. In under 5 minutes, he was snoring. I listened while lying there in the dark and gazing up at the ceiling. You would assume it would be quiet and serene to be so far from civilization. No, it wasn't. There is significance in the silence that exists. Every leaf, rustle, and stream of the wood had a deliberate feel to it, as if the trees were holding their breath. I heard footsteps on the gravel drive sometime after midnight. I was certain it wasn't a deer or a raccoon. It was supported by weight. The crunch of bare feet on loose stones, dragging slowly. My breathing stopped. Simply lay motionless, listening. And I'm still bothered by this. A brief, raspy cough, as if someone were clearing their throat. Human. I sat up and tried not to squeak. The footsteps did not approach. Didn't back down either. They simply ceased. My chest burned from holding my air for so long. Finally, feel was stillness. The next thing I remember is sunlight streaming in through the wall's fissures, so I must have fallen asleep. I noticed them the following morning while we were stacking wood at the edge of the clearing. Human widespread toes, bare feet, and deep impressions in the soft earth that appear to be from flat-footed walking are all examples of footprints, not boot prints or sneakers. I knelt and gazed, immediately struck by how still the woodland was. Old families live out here. Curtis approached, glared at the prints, and mentioned that some of them had never worn shoes in their lives. That was it. Just a shrug and get back to work. No surprise, no worry. As if it had never even occurred to them. I was unable to look away from their prints. The arches collapsed as if the foot had gone crazy due to the excessive spread of the toes. I didn't even try to sleep that night. I listened tensely as I lay there. Indeed, there were voices and sounds, more like mumbling than actual conversation. Whispers that were always just out of grasp and never rose above the breeze. Then there was laughing, short, suppressed chuckles that had no place in the world. It sounded like a child attempting to avoid detection. With my heart racing, I lay motionless after drawing the sleeping bag up to my ears. Not even when the scratching began did Curtis awaken. It wasn't a panic. It wasn't even making an attempt to enter. It was like someone pulling a stick along the wall. It's exploratory. There was a pause beneath the window after long, sluggish scratches that traveled from one end of the cabin to the other. Then there is more scraping, with the wood being lightly scraped by nails, bone, or something else. I muttered the name of Curtis. He let out a grunt, got up as if he had been anticipating it, picked up his rifle, and proceeded to the door. He swung the flashlight across the clearing after opening it. Just trees, nothing, until he gestured toward the drive's ditch. We saw them at that point. Skin as pale as candle wax, crouched low, overly skinny, overly lengthy limbs that eyes that reflected the light incorrectly. They were blank, not blazing or red, and not animal-like. They remained still. They remained still. Then everything burst into motion as the light struck one of them squarely. They remained still. They fell forward, scurrying around on all fours like spiders. Really quick, gone in a matter of seconds. Not a single broken branch, not a sound. Curtis shut the door after slamming it and, just for good measure, pushed a chair beneath the handle. He had a hard line in his mouth. He has a vacant stare. We didn't speak. That night continued to drag. The tapping noises returned to the walls. Fingers grazing the windows. More murmuring, now closer. I remained motionless. Up until the sky began to lighten, I just stared at the ceiling. We went outdoors to see what they had left behind when morning eventually arrived. There were handprints on the porch railing. The dirt beneath the windows has fingerprints in it. The siding had long, deep scrapes that were too deep for fingers and too ragged for any kind of tool. Something seems to have been measuring and testing the walls. Curtis didn't even take a look at it. He went back inside, loaded up all the tools, and packed the vehicle. We didn't complete the work, and all he said when he turned to face me was, "Let's go." Didn't converse during the drive. Story 6 at the age of 34, I made the decision that I needed a true vacation from everything. Noise, people, work, and even my dwelling. For weeks, I had felt restless, but I was unable to remain motionless, as though everything had begun to seem too constricted. I took my usual action in that situation. After gathering my belongings and grabbing my boots, I made my way into the woods. Over the years, I had trekked many paths, primarily throughout Tennessee and Virginia, and occasionally further out if I could get a break. However, I didn't want the typical weekend loop with college students playing guitar at the campsites and trail markers every few miles. I just wanted to be by myself. At my friend Lena's apartment, I discovered a route on an old map of a state park. It was only a little path that curled past the designated loops and was hardly marked. It wasn't even a part of the main trail system. In faded lettering, it said Old Mill Route. I looked it up on the internet. Almost nothing was mentioned. Only a few blurry pictures and a forum post describing how quiet the place is. I only needed that. I said he would be, sort of, with my roommate Milo. I showed him the map and gave him the overall area, but I omitted the section about the unmaintained path. He frets excessively. With 5 days worth of food, my tent, water filter, torch, knife, and several layers, I drove up to Iron Hollow, where there was a worn trailhead sign that hardly stood upright. Light enough to continue going, but enough to be safe. The first day went flawlessly. There are no hikers in the dense forest. I stayed alert because of the coolness in the air. Before I camped by a brook, I traveled 15 miles. No problems. It was different on the second morning. That's when I realized something wasn't right. I froze after unzipping the tent. A few feet away, my walking staff was upright in the ground. Standing, balanced, not wedged, not leaning against a rock. It was the same one that I had thrown out the previous evening. I could recall how I dropped it. It was supposed to be on the ground. I looked for a while, tried to think things through. Perhaps it somehow landed that way. It wasn't a light stick, but perhaps an animal knocked it upright. There was no wind, and the wood was bent and firm. Nothing made sense. Nervous, I finally laughed it off. I told myself I was exaggerating, but I had a gut feeling that something wasn't quite right. The woodland had transformed by the third day, and not in a way I was fond of. The world seemed to have gone silent. Typically, you hear insects, birds, and small animals buzzing by your ear. However, those sounds vanished as I went deeper. The trees grew older and higher. The brush grew thinner. All around me simply fell silent. There were no squirrels or birds, only the sound of my boots crunching and the sound of trees swaying in the wind. I stopped more frequently and continued to look around. I felt like I was being watched, but not for any specific reason. Just observed, not by a hiker or an animal. One of my food bags went stolen that evening. As soon as I opened my pack, I realized something was off. 5 luggage were packed by me. There are 4 now. I initially believed I had tallied incorrectly. Perhaps I had already consumed one. However, I hadn't. I even recalled keeping one hidden at the bottom for the final night, but it was gone. I kept checking. Maybe a raccoon got it. Maybe I dropped it. I told myself after that. Although I didn't think it was true. Not at all. I heard footsteps that night. Around my tent, something moved. Not hurried, not desperate. These were hefty and purposeful. I was still sitting up straight, holding my knife. Outside, the fire was low. The crunch of leaves reached my ears. A pause, followed by another step. They went around me. They stopped at the entryway after doing so once and again. I held my breath. My grasp on the knife caused my hand to cramp. My heart was racing. My shirt was drenched with sweat. It was freezing, but nothing occurred. The steps receded slowly, disappearing into the trees. A final crunch kept me awake. Not even a moment. I located the prints in the morning. Splendid like someone who has never worn shoes, bare feet with broad, odd toes. They were simply incorrect, not enormous. Pushed into the mud too deeply, that single set of tracks circled my tent before disappearing into the undergrowth. I gazed at them for quite a while. I even used my phone to take a picture. I couldn't send it anywhere. There is no service available. I briefly considered going back, but I'd already gone 3 days. Since the nearest ranger station was 2 days behind me, I assumed it wouldn't pursue me further. I was mistaken. The 4th day was worse. It began with clothing. A ripped t-shirt caught on a tree, a filthy sock, a half-torn sneaker with the heel torn off, and a belt, just a piece of leather with a rusty buckle. They weren't elderly. Color was still present. Stitching was still present. It had just been lost by someone. No, I muttered to myself as I accelerated the pace. I continued to walk without stopping for lunch. I heard them again that evening. Multiple, not one. The noises continued past the firelight. Not words, but a low murmur a combination of animal sounds and whispers, clicks, grunts, and other sounds I couldn't identify. They circled and shifted around me. Then a hand pressed on the side of my tent, long fingers and a flat palm. My face was brushed by the fabric as it pulled inward. I didn't think twice. My knife went right through the material. It immediately withdrew, whatever it was, and silence reigned. I packed before dawn, leaving half of my equipment behind. Only my knife, food, and water, and ran. I hardly recall the day. Only the urgency. The trees are too tall. Suddenly, the trail was strange. I tore my jacket open on brambles, slid down hillsides, climbed logs, and cut through bush. Didn't give a damn. All I wanted was to get out. I struck the clearing after that. A circle of trees has been stripped naked. White trunks emerge from the ground like bones. A human jaw, a shattered skull, finger bones that were blackened at the tips, deer antlers, broken ribs, twisted spines, and a pile of bones were all thrown together in the middle. I took a step back, gagged, and fixed my gaze on the pile. Then I raised my head. The ridge was where they were. Low-lying figures were partially obscured by foliage. Ash and grime on the skin. Ropes of hair dangling. Their limbs were tied with scraps of cloth. They simply observed without saying anything or yelling. On all fours, one moved forward. It moved smoothly, too silky, too supple to be human. Another came out, then another. I ran. My face was beaten by branches. My arms were torn. I stumbled, dropped out, got back up, and continued to run. When I hit the ground, I yelled. My knees gave out and my chest burned. I didn't stop, though. Behind me, I could hear them. Still silent, 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 still fast. Then a road, gravel. I felt my knees after stumbling out of the trees. A pickup came around the corner a few minutes later. A man in his 50s who was the driver leaned out to inquire about my well-being. I was unable to talk. I trembled so much that I felt I would faint when I climbed into the truck's bed. Narrative 7, when that occurred, I was 22 years old. For months, my cousin Eli had been urging me to join him on a Blue Ridge Mountains backpacking trip. Not just any hike. He was looking for the real thing. Deep woods, miles off the route. No signal, no GPS, and no one. That's his specialty. He enjoys feeling as though he has vanished off the map. For my part, I enjoy having plumbing and refreshments available. Eli, however, is the tenacious kind. I finally gave in. He wore me down, not because I suddenly felt a need for the outdoors. I thought I could manage a few evenings that we didn't bring much. A stack of protein bars, a cooler, a flask of something too strong, 2 small tents, and a few necessities. Not very fancy. The entire plan was to spend the weekend living simply. We parked close to one of the lesser trailheads, the ones that aren't mentioned in park brochures, after driving out early on Friday. We hiked several miles off the main track by mid-afternoon and came across a space surrounded by big oaks and dense laurel plants. It was silent, still totally isolated from any human activity, with only the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp for sound. Eli loved it right away. He moved about as though he had just found a lost country. I was more careful. I continued to look, that half concerned that the track had been engulfed by trees. We headed back the way we had come. Nevertheless, we made camp, built a respectable fire, and used the fire to cook hot dogs. There was something serene about it, I must say. Eli passed the flask, laughed too much at his own jokes, and recounted stupid stories until I started to feel a relaxed buzz. Even so, there was something strange about the quiet. It was thick, as if the trees were holding their breath, and it wasn't simply quiet. Yes, the fire crackled, but everything else seemed distant and subdued. It's the kind of silence when your ears begin to make up noises to fill the silence. I was beaten by the time the fire began to go out. I zipped up my tent, climbed inside, and reclined on my sleeping bag. Outside, Eli was still laughing and muttering about how city dwellers couldn't cope with true darkness. I rolled my eyes and fell asleep, lulled by the whiskey and the fire's warmth. Something had changed, which is why I woke up at the start. Not because of a loud noise, anyway. Only a few red embers glowed in the darkness like coals, and the fire was nearly out. It was colder in the tent. There was a damp, almost morning coolness in the air. At first, I just listened, remaining motionless. Then I heard it. Gentle motion, Just past the firelight's edge, something or someone is moving. Too silent for a bear, too heavy for a raccoon. Deer was my first thought. They might have sniffed leftover food. It nearly rolled over to sleep again. Then I heard it, not like someone laughing uncontrollably. It was weak and strained, with only a few brief outbursts, as if someone were attempting to mimic a laugh without really understanding what it meant. It began low, perhaps 20 feet away from the tent. Then a voice from the opposite side joined in. The way it came out was off-key, too quick, and not human. It was not happy. It sounded incorrect, similar to a recording that is played too slowly. My heartbeat changed rhythms. More motion. Bare feet, soft, rapid steps from its slapping sound against the dead leaves and dirt that were circling the camp. Then my tent side was stroked by something. Not brushed, bumped, or dragged from one end to the other by fingers slowly and purposefully. My body became immobile. I was afraid to breathe. I bided my time until the noise subsided. Rather, it became nearer. On the opposite side, the identical dragging process began once more. This time, lighter. It's almost playful. I grabbed the zipper with my hand. Instinct. I simply have to see. I lowered it an inch to find out. The dying embers cast a faint orange glow across the clearing. Enough light to make out the shapes, but not much. At least 3 of them were present. Pale. Not like a sick person, but like something that hasn't been exposed to sunshine in years. Their bodies were angled, with limbs excessively long, shoulders too high, and knees protruding laterally. They scuttled quickly and low on all fours. Occasionally, however, one would jump to his feet like a puppet pulled by strings. Too sharp, too fast. They had some sort of ash or muck on their skin. Their giddy mats of long hair hung over their faces, clumped together. Under the thin skin, I could see ribs rising and falling as if they were gasping for air due to hunger or excitement. One edged toward the flames. It turned slowly toward my tent after tilting its head and sniffing at the air. It had an animal countenance, but its eyes glinted like glass in the ember light. It was interesting, concentrated, too intent. Eli's tent caught my attention. Keep quiet, not a move. He was still asleep. The closest one snapped its head in my direction just as I was beginning to shift slightly to slip the zipper open wider. They simply locked eyes without warning. The flesh around its lips was split and raw, as if it had been gnawing on itself, and its mouth was ripped open. It grinned, or at least appeared to smile. Then it whistled without averting its gaze. It was a harsh, high sound. Like a signal, it sliced through the trees. One whistle responded, followed by another. The entire forest came alive with it in a matter of seconds. This impossible chorus is created by high-pitched whistles that bounce between the ridges, reverberate off trunks, overlap, and weave. Too many. They seem to be all around us, above us, and waiting just beyond the shadows. I didn't consider it. After unzipping the tins, I ran over to Eli's. I shook his shoulders until his eyes opened, almost jumping onto him. He didn't inquire. He didn't have to. After sitting up and listening for 2 seconds, he took off running. We left everything behind. Food, tents, equipment. Didn't even turn around. Simply ran. I took the lead, guiding a shaky beam across the trees with my flashlight. It was hardly helpful that I could see pale limbs darting between trunks every few steps, following us. The whistles stayed close, not chasing, following, tracking, pushing us like they wanted to see where we'd go. I heard the slapping of bare feet on the woodland floor. Light but fast. Too fast. Too fast. We ran until our legs felt like rubber. We tripped, slid, scraped ourselves on rocks and roots. I remember falling once and thinking, this is it. But Eli pulled me up without a word, and we kept going. Then just when it felt like we'd been running forever, my light hit something nailed to a tree, a trail marker. Old, barely legible, but definitely there. The trail. We didn't stop. We didn't say a word. We just bolted down it. I don't remember much about that part. Just branches whipping my face, gravel sliding underfoot, the burning in my lungs. I kept expecting to feel a hand on my ankle, a face right behind me. But slowly, the whistles started to fade. The footsteps thinned out. The forest began to feel like a forest again, not a trap. Eventually, it was just the sound of our breathing and the crunch of gravel. When we saw the break in the trees and the edge of the lot, I nearly dropped to my knees. Our car was still there, untouched, waiting. We climbed in, slammed the doors, locked them. Neither of us spoke for a long time, just sat there staring straight ahead. Finally, Eli replied, "How many were there?" I shook my head. I didn't count because I couldn't. The woods were full with them. We drove through the night, windows up, not looking back. Every turn in the road felt like a chance for something to appear in the headlights. I haven't gone back. I no longer trek. Even traveling close to that area of the state bothers me. Story 8. The last time I tented alone in the Blue Ash Mountains, I returned with a strong gut feeling that something that doesn't belong in this world was out there. This was no careless survival test or one of those weeks-long journeys when individuals search for themselves. It was meant to be straightforward, just a one-night getaway from electronics, traffic, and awkward interactions. The sort of sound that you don't notice until it's gone. After a lengthy run of consecutive workdays and excessive indoor time, I reasoned that I should take a night off. I have hiked a lot on my own before. This was nothing new. I was aware of how to prepare, what to pack, what to anticipate. I chose one of the more sedate circuits close to the northern ridge, a track I had only hiked once in the previous years. It's not quite deserted, but it's far enough away that I doubt I'd see more than one or two people, if that. It was the kind of setting where your thoughts are free to roam and the silence is heavy in your ears. I arrived in the middle of the morning and parked at a small pull-off that could hardly accommodate 2 automobiles. There were no other people present. I made sure I had my tent, food, drink, first aid supplies, flashlight, knife, and other essentials. Nothing fancy, no stove. I wasn't there to prepare a fine dining experience. All I wanted to do was go on a walk, sleep beneath some trees, and wake up the following day with a fresh perspective. It was a steep start to the trail that I T-cut through thick forest. Backs of switches twisting one after the other. You keep going in the wrong direction, believing you've made progress, only to discover you've been going up the same hill repeatedly from different perspectives. I didn't mind though. That's the part one enjoy. The sound of boots scuffing the ground, the burden of the bag on your shoulders, and the passing of time. I discovered a clearing close to the ridge in the early afternoon. It was a small, level area between trees where someone else had erected a small fire pit and a tent for one person. It appeared unaltered, no trash, not a single footprint. Excellent that I opted to explore before dark, abandoned my equipment, and had a fast trail mix in a granola bar. I didn't want to spend hours sitting here. I barely removed the necessities and left the tent partially put together. Water, knife, and flashlight. The sky remained luminous. There's still a few hours of light. Above the ridge, the track became more of a deer path, which is still discernible but unmaintained. Broken branches, soft dirt, and roots that are just ready to trip you up. I took it all in as I proceeded gently, and it became quieter the farther I went. All day, I had not heard or seen anyone. Andy thought that was the point. I kept reminding myself that the reason I had come out here was to experience this silence and the sensation of being the only living thing in the area. However, I began to feel, not precisely cleaned, but aware of something, around 3 o'clock or perhaps a little earlier. It began modestly. Something moved about 40 feet off the trail as I glanced up the slope. Something pale moved between trees in a flash. I paused, narrowing my eyes. Despite the dense, closely spaced trunks, I believe I spotted a form. A shape, not simply a blur. It wasn't four-legged or animal-shaped. It was tall, slim, and upright. IT went by too fast behind one trunk, then another, and finally disappeared. I waited. There was nothing visible. I eventually dismissed it, reasoning that it might have been shadows playing games or that it was light on a pale rock. Nevertheless, I held my flashlight ready, not on. The path wound around a precipitous cliff. One side is open air. You didn't want to fall down the slope. A wall of brush and trees on the opposite side. When I heard it, I was paying attention to my footing and going more slowly. Nor a squirrel, nor wind rustling behind me. This was walking steadily through the dry underbrush like footsteps barely visible. I paused. The sound did the same. I turned around and activated my flashlight. The green was sliced by the beam. Just woods and an empty trail. Nothing. For 20 seconds, there was nothing but the hum of the woodland air as I stood there. I turned to continue going. The sound began once more. Nearer. My steps have the same rhythm. It didn't appeal to me. "Hey, anyone there? You okay?" I yelled out, trying to appear relaxed and informal. Nothing. No echo. No bird sounds. No reaction. I walked more quickly. Not a jog, but also not a stroll. I kept hearing it, always behind me, always in sync. The trail was then blocked by a fallen tree. It's getting dark, too narrow to climb, too wide to hop. That was the turning point for me. I started over. Everything changed at that point. It was a different woodland. Closer, tighter. The wrestling resumed. First to my left, and then to my right, then I'm being paced by two sets. I paused. They also did. With a sharp thumping, I quickly turned and used the spotlight to scan, and I spotted it. 10 feet from the path, something whitish was trapped between two trunks. I initially believed it to be bark, but it was too smooth and meaty. It was a slender arm with an elbow bent at an odd angle, as if it had been stuck there. Then it moved. Like it had been tugged, it jerked back into the darkness. I got cold sweats, either flight or fight mode. Unthinking, I lifted my knife. Then, from in front, from behind a tree, a face peered forth, dirt-covered and filthy. How still it was, eyes wide, motionless, just looking unblinking and unhuman. I said, "Knife up." I demanded to know their identity and their desires. No response. Then, from the woods, something fell. It scrambled across the path like it didn't know how to use legs after hitting it on all fours. Skin hanging slack, ribs protruding, malnourished and skim. Fabric remnants, or even no fabric at all. It moved quickly, soundlessly, without speech or breath. That was it, with branches splitting overhead and rustling everywhere. They followed me as I raced as hard as I could. With a crunch of bark, one fell someplace behind me after soaring up a tree like a spider. I didn't care and didn't look. I simply ran. I was gasping when I finally made out my tent, which was only a dim huddle through the trees. Everything was on fire. Chest, neck, and legs. I jumped in and pulled the zipper closed. Something smashed into the wall a second later. The entire tent trembled. Next, a hand touched the nylon. The outline caught my eye. Too stiff, too lengthy fingers. It moved slowly, following the curvature of the zipper, as if it were trying to figure out how to open it. I went cold, both hands holding a knife, arms trembling. The pressure persisted indefinitely. Just a steady drag of fingers, no snarl, no voice. Then nothing was left. All night long, I listened while keeping my knees tucked in. I didn't trust the silence, yet there were no more sounds. I gathered everything at first light and packed it in my rucksack. Didn't get together. The tent was pushed in damp and loose without being folded. I had Togo. I felt them the entire way down the hike. Sensed rather than seen. I vowed that something stopped each time I paused to catch my breath. I almost fell as the trail turned to gravel and I could make out the parking lot through the underbrush. I have never returned. Story 9. Music. Mostly because it was close to university, I had chosen Alder Ridge Trail in North Carolina. Additionally, it didn't get as congested as the loops that were more well-known. This didn't seem like a huge concern because I had hiked alone a lot previously. To be honest, my excitement was greater than anything else. I triple-checked my equipment, planned a route for a week, and even Medea's stupid little drive-up playlist. Just some alone time in the woods, away from people and noise, was what it was going to be. Shortly after daybreak, I pulled into the trailhead parking area. It was one of those ungated back-row gravel lots. Just a small wooden board with sun-faded maps and trail information pinned beneath a cracked piece of plexiglass. There were maybe 2 or 3 more automobiles there, as I recall. Not a soul in sight. It wasn't cold. It was cool. At the beginning of a lengthy hike, I had a mixture of calm and anxious energy. Everything was as usual. The track was well marked and broad at first. It was evident that there was some foot traffic, but not enough to prevent the reintroduction of the underbrush. A few wooden signs with painted and carved route names were affixed to the trees as I went by. Some were so faded that they could hardly be read. It became quieter the further I traveled, and not in a serene sense. Rather, it was as if everything had gone silent. After the first mile, the sound of birds stopped. Just the crunch of my boots and the sporadic squeak of my pack straps. No air, no rustling leaves. It was some time before I began to notice the small details. The track appeared somewhat more constrained than what I had recalled from a map. That was not unprecedented. There were places where I had to walk over fallen branches that appeared to have been there for weeks, even though maps are sometimes outdated. There is no indication that anyone has recently cleared the path. As well as the trail's prints, there were a few at start. Eventually, they simply ceased. Nothing else. No bike tires, no other boot imprints. Only mine. I arrived at this rocky overlook at about noon. The view is good, but none of the maps I had indicated it. A rough ledge that opened onto a pine slope. I took out my water bottle, rested for a while, then searched through my pack for a snack. Something moving in the brush beneath the ledge is what I heard at that moment. I initially thought it might have been a raccoon or a deer. There is only a faint push of branches, as if something were moving slowly through dense undergrowth, and there was no sound. Leaning over, I tried to catch a glimpse. I saw it at that moment. There saw someone squatting amid the trees, without moving or standing, as if they had been waiting there for a while. The shape was unquestionably human, but they were too far away and still for me to discern any details. That is not how any animal moves. I shouted and held out a hand. "Hey, you all right down there?" With no response or action. Then they moved. Only a small elbow or shoulder. I was unable to tell. They darted sideways into the trees in a single, flowing move. Darting, not running nor strolling. Quick! It shook me. However, I convinced myself that it was only an off-grid hiker trying to hide. Such folks do exist. Those who simply want to be left alone or survivalists. Something about the way they moved lingered with me, even though I tried to shrug it off. I pretended to complete my snack for a few more minutes, but in reality, I was listening. Nothing else was heard by me. I eventually started moving again, but after that, something didn't feel right. The appearance of the trail has changed. I couldn't explain it, yet the trees seemed closer, as if there was less light since the canopy was thicker. It was terrible, that quiet. There was no sound to ring against, so it wasn't simply quiet. It felt heavy, like if my ears were ringing. I began to hear footsteps at that point. They were just far enough behind me for me to be unable to discern if they were real, not loud, soft, subtle, imperceptible. They would cease walking as well as I would. My heart pounded in my throat as I repeatedly spun around, looking around the route. Nothing. The woods are vacant. However, I wasn't by myself. I had a gut feeling. I sped up without drawing attention to myself. Pretending I had somewhere to be, I sped up a bit. Sweating, my palms tightened their grasp on my straps. I was afraid to insert earbuds. I had to hear it all. Then I noticed something. I saw a glimmer of movement through the trees about 30 feet behind me. Out behind a tree stump, long, matted hair vanishes. Just that flash, no sound. I paused and waited. Nothing was revealed. I continued. I eventually came to a trail fork. On the way up, I recalled seeing a wooden post with clear markings of the fork for directions. Now the post was on the ground, neatly pulled out and undamaged. The signs are gone and there is no debris. Only the wooden foundation, as if someone had stolen the rest, was resting on its side. The fear really started to set in at that point. I gazed at the two paths, trying to recall which was the correct path. I took a left. I'm not sure why, perhaps instinct. The trail seemed good as it twisted downhill. However, I saw the prints after 5 minutes. They weren't from sneakers or hiking boots. Their feet were bare. They overlapped in dozens. Deep, broad footprints on the soil. Some are shorter than me, while some are longer. Children. They circled the trail and headed off into the woods in all directions. I halted my movement and gazed. I could hear my own breath catching because it was so quiet. Then, straight ahead, I heard a tremendous crack, but an underweight branch snapping. I went cold. A slender, shirtless man emerged from behind a tree. He looked as though he had rolled in the dirt, hair covering the majority of his face. He just stared at me without saying anything or blinking. He seemed to be timing his breaths as his chest moved slowly. I was immobile. Then, one by one, more people came out of the trees surrounding him. Just movement, no sound. Initially, I counted 5, a woman, 2 men, and 2 children, all coated in dirt and filth. They didn't exchange glances. They all gave me a look. No facial expressions, no yelling, just huge, fixed eyes. I did not turn and jog, nor did I rush away. I rushed, as if a primal instinct had taken over. With each step, my rucksack smashed against my back. I could hardly keep my legs up. Behind me, I heard the crash. Bodies tearing through undergrowth, branches snapping. I anticipated their arrival. They were just chasing quickly, not shouting. My sleeve grabbed as something violently pulled my arm and dragged me sideways. How I didn't go down is beyond me. I tore free and continued to run. I'm becoming blind from adrenaline. I can't recall how many times I stumbled or what I walked on. The path became wider. I noticed some sun, followed by our relatives just ahead. Like they were going on a weekend excursion, 2 parents and their children were smiling and moving slowly. I yelled at them, commanded them to flee, and warned them that I was being pursued. Startled, the father stepped forward. The mother seized her children. I almost collided with them as I blew by them. There was nobody there when I eventually turned to look behind me, expecting to see those people exploding from the trees. There were still no trails in the woods, just trees. The family looked at me as if I had gone crazy. I must have looked crazy. Torn sleeve, dirt-smeared, furious eyes. I didn't pause to describe, simply continued, legs trembling all the way down. I headed directly to my car as soon as I arrived at the parking lot. I hurled myself inside, secured the doors, and simply sat with my hands on the steering wheel, gasping like if I had just completed a marathon while submerged. It took me some time to drive away, not until I was certain I hadn't been followed. Alder Ridge is somewhere I've never returned to. Won't even pass the neighborhood in a car. Story 10. In early September, I hiked alone through a portion of the Bearskin Range. Just a peaceful 3-day loop, nothing spectacular. I had done that previously. The trek wasn't the type that was included in travel guides. Not far enough away to be a journey for the bucket list. Too far away to be a leisurely weekend walk. However, it was just the kind of location I enjoyed. Setting out on your own has a peculiarly pleasant quality. There are miles of trail ahead, only a pack on your back. The habit quickly becomes second nature. Walk, relax, and walk some more till your feet give up. Make camp. Consume something that is somewhat warm. Then pass out in a tent that smells like trail mix and wet nylon. There is life in the silence. It has layers and is thick. When you're far enough away that the world's background hum stops, you can tell the difference. Just you, the wind, and whatever the trees choose to let you hear. No automobiles, no power lines, no dogs barking in the distance. My rhythm had been established by the second afternoon. My legs ached in that gratifying, well-earned manner. I had a respectable pace. Near a stand of red-turning maples, I came to a halt at a small brook that crossed the trail. I took out my filter pump, squatted down beside the mossy bank, and began filling my bottle. Then I saw something on the other side of the ocean. It appeared as if someone had laid down there long enough for a body, and the grass on the other side was flattened in this disturbingly accurate rectangle. I initially thought it might be a deer bed, but the shape seemed too neat. There are no scuffle marks. It's a perfectly compressed region in the brush with no tracks going to it. They weren't freshly pressed, but the inventories hadn't recovered yet. A night or 2 old, perhaps. I paused long enough to notice it clearly. I looked around at the trees, anticipated seeing a knapsack dangling from a branch or a tent hidden somewhere. If someone had slept off the route, there might have been some trash left over. However, nothing was present. Not a single footprint. Not even fire ashes. Not even a discarded wrapper or a broken twig. That spooky little outline. Someone had spent the night there and disappeared. I got up more slowly than I intended to. My knees broke. As I packed my bottle and started to go again, I recall looking over my shoulder several times. Something changed with that one patch. I had been calm, attentive, and relaxed all morning. But after that, I began to pay attention to every leaf rustle and twig snap. The trees felt strange, as if they were keeping something back, but they didn't seem any different. After an hour, I arrived at a clearing that, in normal conditions, would have been an excellent place to camp. It had a slight elevation on one side to keep the wind out and a gentle spread of pine needles. I stretched my shoulders and put my pack down, eager to get comfortable. Then I noticed it. A short strand of rope hung from a low branch on the far end of the clearing. Not only a bit of garbage, it had been purposefully tied. It swayed a little as if it had been carefully hung. Tiny bones were strung along the string. Clean, bleached white, dozens of them. Hardly audible, but persistent, they clicked together in the breeze. Perhaps squirrels or bird bones. It had purpose, but it wasn't precisely a scientific demonstration. I just looked as I froze. It wasn't arbitrary. Every bone was equally spaced and knotted separately. They were neatly knotted. It had been made by someone who had taken their time. My gut churned. Not like a craft project, not like a hunter's marker. It seemed like a warning, something you shouldn't see twice. It wasn't where I camped. I didn't even take a seat. I tightened my pack straps once more and started to move. Even though my legs were about to give out and it was becoming late, I didn't care. Some internal switch had been turned by that subtle little charm. I felt every instinct telling me to keep that clearing farther away. I became aware of how quiet everything had become as I ventured farther into the forest. Perhaps I'd been too preoccupied with the bones to see it at first. Now, however, it was obvious. No rustling animals, no bird sounds. The insects have vanished as well. Only my own breathing and footsteps. It was only timing, I told myself. Sometimes the woods do that. Without warning, fall silent. Perhaps a storm was on its way. The silence might have been caused by an owl, but it didn't feel right. The whole woodland seemed to be waiting. It wasn't until shortly before sunset that I discovered another campsite. There was only a little level area between two boulders. My tent would barely fit, but it would do. Muscles twitching from residual stress, I moved quickly. I jumped every time a branch shattered behind me. My pot once clattered against a rock after I knocked it over. I really apologized aloud since the sound was so piercing in the silence, as if I was afraid of awakening anything. As quickly as could, I took down the tent stake. Just water and nutrition bars, no cooking or bonfire. I wanted as little attention as possible. In an attempt to get my heart to return to something like normal, I zipped myself in and sat there with my knife that I heard it at that point. To the right, there are footsteps, moving through the trees in calm, purposeful steps, not stumbling, not rushing. It was a deer, I convinced myself. A large one. However, that is not how deer move, and they do not stop in between strides. I listened, gasping for air. It then came to a halt. I heard nothing except wind for a long time. Then it returned around midnight or whatever. I never heard it get close. It appeared out of nowhere. Circled the tent closely. Something was dragging along the fabric, and I could hear it. No close, not stop. Something subtle but deliberate, similar to fingers gliding over nylon. I remained motionless, didn't even blink. I had cramps in my hand around the knife. It had turned cold, yet I could still feel the perspiration running down my back. The sound that still makes my skin crawl that arrived. Low laughter, like someone attempting to remember how to laugh. It's low, broken, and uneven that IT was close but not noisy. Directly outdoors, the rasp in their throat and the hitch in their breath were audible to me. Whoever it was, I'm positive it wasn't an animal. It sounded unhealthy, sounded as though they hadn't spoken to anyone in a while. Then the odor struck. Sweat, moist earth, rot, and human, but incorrect. As if they hadn't taken a shower or ventured outside in weeks, or perhaps longer. I remained motionless. I was unable to. I simply remained motionless, anticipating a worse scenario. However, it didn't. The sound eventually subsided. The odor persisted longer than it ought to have. However, I realized I couldn't stay there until I was certain it was truly gone. In silence, I packed what I could and exited the tent. There is no way to remove it without making a marching band noise. I simply snatched up my pack and headlamp and snuck out as quietly as possible. It felt like a firecracker every time I walked on a twig. I never once looked back. It was a blur of a path. The rare heart-stopping reflection for what I convinced myself were animal eyes, trees, and shadows. They were too high the second time I viewed them above a deer, nearly higher than a person. I didn't pause to measure, though, simply continued to walk. The entire time, I muttered to myself, songs, grocery lists, foolish things, anything that has a human voice, even if it's mine. By the time the sun rose, my throat was raw, and I nearly burst into tears when I wandered onto a dirt fire road, merely a broad stony scar that runs through the forest. I sat there in the open, my heart still pounding as if I had sprinted the entire distance, my legs shaking too much to stand. How long I sat there is a mystery to me. An hour or longer, perhaps. Somehow, around the bend, a bunch of day hikers emerged, giggling over something. As soon as they noticed me, they stopped talking. Eyes wide, pack half open, dirt-strewn. They inquired about my well-being. I made an effort to clarify. I described the scent, the bones, the dragging noises, and the footsteps to them. They didn't make fun of me for not being able to organize everything. Didn't even appear perplexed. The rest of them gently invited me to accompany them on their walk after one of them. An elderly man in his 50s simply nodded slowly as if he had heard the story before. I never returned to retrieve the tent. Didn't give it much thought till several weeks later to be why then. The notion of returning to that section, my stomach turned in knots at the sight of the woodland that I didn't keep it. Whatever was discovered, I wasn't going to give it another shot out there.